Think you know everything about Irwin Allen's 1966 time travel series? From Dennis Hopper's deleted scenes disguised as a woman to a show canceled for a Western that bombed worse than it did, the time tunnel hides bizarre production secrets, jaw-dropping historical inaccuracies, and one of Hollywood's most ironic cancellation stories that would make any time traveler's head spin. Fact 1. Dennis Hopper was completely cut from the pilot. Before Dennis Hopper became a counterculture icon with Easy Rider in 1969, he was just another working actor trying to make it in Hollywood. And in 1966, that meant taking whatever television roles came his way. When Irwin Allen was casting the pilot episode for The Time Tunnel, Hopper signed on to play a passenger named Tabor aboard the doomed Titanic, and he filmed multiple scenes for what he thought would be a recurring subplot throughout the premiere episode. The weirdest part of Hopper's performance was that in at least one scene, he appeared disguised as a woman in drag, which would have been a pretty bold choice for 1960s television. But when the editors started putting the pilot together, they quickly realized they had a major problem on their hands because the network had strict time requirements and the episode was running way too long with all of Hopper's scenes included. Rather than trying to trim his subplot down to a manageable size, the producers made the decision to simply cut the entire thing out completely, leaving Dennis Hopper almost entirely on the cutting room floor. If you watch the pilot episode carefully today, you can still catch brief glimpses of Hopper in the background of a couple of Titanic scenes, just standing there as an extra, which is all that remains of what was supposed to be a much larger role. Photos from the production still exist showing Hopper in full costume as Tabor, giving us a glimpse of what could have been, but his deleted scenes have never been released to the public and likely never will be. Fact 2. The show was set 2 years in the future. Most viewers watching The Time Tunnel when it first aired on ABC between September 1966 and April 1967 probably assumed the show was taking place in the present day. But if you paid close attention to the dialogue and the premise, you'd notice something peculiar about when the story was actually happening. The entire series was set in 1968, which meant that while audiences were sitting in their living rooms watching the show in 1966 and 1967, the scientists at Project Tick-Tock were supposedly working 2 years ahead in the future. This wasn't just a minor detail either, as the show explicitly established that the underground time travel facility had been under construction and development for 10 years by 1968. And characters occasionally mentioned the year out loud in dialogue. The decision to set the show slightly in the future was likely meant to give the advanced technology and the massive $7.5 billion project a bit more believability, since placing it 2 years ahead made the futuristic time machine seem just barely within reach of what was scientifically possible. It also created an interesting layer to the show's premise, because the time tunnel wasn't just sending people backward and forward through history, it was technically a science fiction show about the future that happened to focus on characters traveling to the past, making it both a period piece and a futuristic adventure at the same time. Fact 3. It was canceled for a worse show. The cancellation of The Time Tunnel remains one of the most frustrating and ironic stories in television history, especially when you consider that the show was actually doing quite well in the ratings. The Time Tunnel aired on Friday nights, which was often called the death slot for TV programs because shows scheduled there typically struggled to find an audience. But despite this challenging time slot, The Time Tunnel pulled in solid numbers, and ABC executives even pointed to it as one of the few bright spots in what was otherwise a pretty disastrous schedule for the network. The cast and crew were so confident about getting renewed for a second season that they actually held a renewal party in the summer of 1967 to celebrate. But their joy was short-lived, because an executive at ABC had been quietly lobbying behind the scenes to cancel The Time Tunnel and replace it with a Western series called The Legend of Custer. The executive apparently convinced enough people that a show about General Custer would be more appealing than Irwin Allen's science fiction time travel adventure. And since the fall schedule hadn't been officially announced yet, he managed to get the time tunnel dropped from the lineup. The Legend of Custer premiered in the fall of 1967 and was immediately torn apart by critics who hated it. And it also faced backlash from Native American groups who objected to its portrayal of history. The show was quickly canceled after airing only 17 episodes, and its ratings were actually worse than the time tunnel had ever been. Fact 4. A 2002 remake was killed by Firefly. In 2002, Fox Television decided to take another shot at bringing the time tunnel back to life, and they went pretty far into the development process by actually producing a full pilot episode with a much darker and more serious tone than the original 1960s series. The remake was being developed by 20th Century Fox Television and Regency Television in partnership with Irwin Allen Properties, and it even had Sheila Allen, Irwin's widow, credited as one of the producers to keep the connection to the original show intact. The new version changed quite a bit from the classic series, turning the time tunnel into a Department of Energy research project focused on nuclear fusion that accidentally created something called a time storm, which started messing up historical events. And the main character, Doug Phillips, was joined by a female character named Tony Newman instead of the original Tony Newman. Fox executives watched the finished pilot and had to make a difficult programming decision about which shows would make it onto their fall schedule, and they ultimately chose to pass on the Time Tunnel remake in order to make room for a new science fiction Western series created by Joss Whedon called Firefly. The irony of this decision became painfully clear just a few months later when Firefly itself became one of the most infamous cancellations in television history, getting pulled off the air after only 11 of its 14 produced episodes had been broadcast, which meant that Fox had essentially rejected one cult science fiction show in favor of another cult science fiction show that would also end up canceled before finishing its first season. Fact 5. The time vortex effect looked like brown pea soup. When the producers of the time tunnel were trying to figure out how to visually show the characters traveling through time, they initially had what seemed like a clever idea that would tie into the show's concept of visiting different historical periods. Their original plan was to create a time vortex effect by using clips of stock film footage from various eras in history. So, as the time travelers were being transported from one period to another, viewers would see rapid-fire images of different time periods speeding past them on screen, which would have been a nice way to emphasize the journey through the corridors of time. The special effects team put together a test version of this concept to see how it would look on camera. But when they screened the footage for the first time, everyone in the room immediately realized they had a serious problem on their hands. The effect of all that historical footage being sped up and blurred together didn't create the exciting, dynamic visual they were hoping for. And instead, it just looked like a murky, brownish mess that one crew member famously described as resembling a blurry version of brown pea soup. The effect was so unappealing and difficult to watch that the producers knew they couldn't use it in the actual show. So they went back to the drawing board and came up with the iconic pop art tunnel design that the series is still remembered for today, with its striking concentric rings that appeared to fade off into infinity through clever use of matte paintings and camera work. Fact 6. John Williams composed the theme as Johnny Williams. Long before John Williams became one of the most celebrated film composers in history with iconic scores for Star Wars, Jaws, and Indiana Jones, he was a young television composer trying to make a name for himself in Hollywood, and in 1966, he was still going, by the more casual nickname Johnny Williams in his professional credits. When Irwin Allen was putting together the Time Tunnel, he had already worked with Williams on his other science fiction series, Lost in Space, and he was impressed enough with the composer's work to bring him back for this new show. Williams was given the challenging task of creating music that could work for both the futuristic science fiction elements of the underground time travel facility and the various historical periods that the characters would be visiting each week, which required a more versatile approach than a typical TV series would need. The opening theme that Williams composed for the Time Tunnel became one of his early signature pieces, featuring prominent French horns, percussion, flutes, trumpets, and harp in a countdown-style arrangement that built tension and excitement. At the time Williams composed this music, he had only scored about a dozen films with relatively obscure titles. So, The Time Tunnel represented one of his first major television scoring assignments and helped establish his reputation in the industry. The show's credits list him as Johnny Williams, and it would be another decade before he fully transitioned to using John Williams professionally and went on to become one of the most awarded composers in entertainment history. Fact 7. Black and white footage was tinted for color episodes. The Time Tunnel was produced during an era when color television was becoming the new standard, which meant that audiences expected to see shows filmed in vibrant color rather than black and white. But this created a unique challenge for Irwin Allen and his production team. One of the main ways the show kept its costs under control was by using stock footage from old movies in the massive 20th Century Fox film library, which gave them access to spectacular scenes of historical events like the sinking of the Titanic, battles from various wars, and other epic moments that would have been impossibly expensive to recreate from scratch for a weekly television series. The problem was that many of these classic films had been shot in black and white decades earlier, and simply cutting black and white footage into a color television show would have looked jarring and unprofessional to viewers watching at home. Rather than giving up on using this valuable library footage, the producers decided to manually tint the black and white clips to add color to them, which was a time-consuming and imperfect process that involved adding artificial color tones to the old film stock. The results were mixed at best, and if you watch the show carefully, you can definitely notice scenes where the stock footage has an odd, washed-out quality that doesn't quite match the rest of the episode, creating an inconsistent visual style that shifts between the crisp color of newly filmed scenes and the somewhat murky, artificially tinted historical footage. Fact 8. The Titanic captain had the wrong name. The pilot episode of The Time Tunnel sent the main characters back to April 1912 aboard the RMS Titanic just hours before it hit an iceberg and sank, which was a dramatic and exciting way to launch the series. But the writers made a pretty glaring historical error that anyone familiar with the disaster would have immediately noticed. In the episode, the captain of the Titanic is referred to as Captain Malcolm Smith, when in reality, the ship's actual captain was named Edward John Smith, who was one of the most experienced and respected commanders in the White Star Line at the time of the voyage. What makes this mistake even more baffling is that the Titanic disaster was extremely well documented by 1966, and there was absolutely no excuse for getting such a basic fact wrong about one of the most famous maritime tragedies in history. Walter Lord's best-selling book, A Night to Remember, had been published back in 1955, more than a decade before The Time Tunnel aired, and it contained detailed and accurate information about Captain Smith and virtually every other aspect of the Titanic's final voyage. The book had even been adapted into a successful film in 1958, so the true facts about the disaster were readily available to anyone who bothered to do even the most basic research. The episode also gave fictional names to the Titanic's secondary officers, further compounding the historical inaccuracies that peppered the pilot and set a pattern for the show's casual relationship with historical accuracy throughout its run. Fact 9. Only one set was built for the entire series. When you watch The Time Tunnel and see the impressive underground complex with its massive control room full of blinking computers and the iconic spiral tunnel stretching off into infinity, you might assume that Irwin Allen spared no expense in building elaborate sets for the show, but the reality of the production was far more modest and cost-conscious than it appeared on screen. In fact, the only permanent set that was actually constructed specifically for the series was the time tunnel control room itself, which housed all the scenes with the scientists trying to rescue Tony and Doug from various points in history. For the pilot episode, the production team did build a larger control room set and created a longer version of the tunnel using optical matte shots to make everything look more impressive and expansive. But after the pilot was finished, the show moved to a smaller sound stage and the control room set had to be scaled down significantly to fit the new space. Every other location that appeared throughout the 30 episodes of the series was filmed somewhere else entirely, with the actors shooting their historical adventure scenes either on the 20th Century Fox backlot, in different studios around the lot, on location in Southern California, or on recycled sets that had been left over from other productions. This incredibly frugal approach to set construction was one of the main ways the show managed to keep its budget under control while still delivering a new time travel adventure every single week. Fact 10. Stock footage came from studios beyond Fox. There's a widespread myth among fans of the time tunnel that Irwin Allen only used stock footage from films in the 20th Century Fox library, since that was the studio producing the show. But the reality of how Allen sourced his historical footage was actually much more interesting and expansive than most people realize. Allen maintained a massive binder that was at least 3 inches thick, filled with detailed lists of available stock footage from multiple major Hollywood studios, not just Fox. This comprehensive resource catalog included clips from MGM, Disney, Columbia Pictures, and Republic Pictures, giving the production team access to a huge variety of historical battle scenes, crowd shots, and spectacular action sequences that had been filmed over decades of movie making. Each entry in the binder broke down the available footage from specific films with detailed information about what action was happening in each scene and exactly how long each clip ran, which made it easy for the writers and editors to plan out episodes around whatever footage was most readily available and affordable to license. One example that proves Allen looked beyond Fox was an episode of his other series, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, which featured stock footage from Columbia Pictures' 1955 science fiction classic, It Came from Beneath the Sea. This cross-studio approach to gathering footage was essential to making the time tunnel work on a television budget, because it gave the show access to expensive-looking historical sequences that would have been impossible to recreate from scratch every week. Fact 11. The hero's clothes magically reset each episode. One of the most glaring continuity issues that ran throughout the time tunnel's entire run was the mysteriously self-repairing wardrobe that Tony Newman and Doug Phillips seemed to possess, which conveniently reset itself every single episode without any explanation whatsoever. During their adventures through different time periods, the two scientists would regularly get into fights, fall into water, crawl through dirt, get their clothes ripped and torn, or sometimes even change into period-appropriate costumes from whatever era they happened to be visiting at the time. By the end of most episodes, their outfits would be absolutely filthy and damaged from whatever dangerous situation they had just survived, whether that was escaping from a sinking ship, running through a battlefield, or being captured and held prisoner by various historical figures. But then, at the start of the very next episode, when the time tunnel would fling them to a new location in history, Tony and Doug would magically appear wearing their original, pristine outfits again, looking completely clean and well-pressed, as if nothing had happened to them. The show never offered any kind of explanation for this phenomenon, like suggesting that the time travel process somehow restored their clothing, or that the scientists back at the control room were able to send them fresh outfits between jumps. Viewers who watched the show week after week couldn't help but notice this pattern, and one fan even joked that if the scientists at Project Tick-Tock could build a time machine, it probably wasn't too difficult to throw in an instant clothes changer and time traveler touch-up device as well. Fact 12. Tony's age changed mid-series. Continuity errors were fairly common in 1960s television shows since most series were produced quickly without much concern for keeping track of small details across episodes. But the time tunnel managed to create a particularly confusing mistake when it came to establishing the age and birth year of one of its main characters, Tony Newman. In the very first episode of the series, Tony clearly states that he was born in 1938, which would have made him about 30 years old during the show's setting in 1968. And this seemed like a perfectly reasonable age for a brilliant young scientist working on a top-secret government project. However, just a few episodes later, in an installment titled The Day the Sky Fell In, which sent Tony back to Pearl Harbor on the day of the Japanese attack in December 1941, the character mentions that he was 7 years old when the attack happened, which creates an immediate mathematical problem. If Tony was actually 7 years old in December of 1941, that would mean he had to have been born sometime in either 1933 or 1934, depending on whether his birthday had already passed by December, which is a full 4 or 5 years earlier than the birth year he stated in the pilot episode. The show never acknowledged or corrected this discrepancy, and interestingly enough, the real birth date of actor James Darren, who played Tony, falls right in between these two contradictory years, as he was born on June 8, 1936. Fact 13. Props were recycled across multiple Irwin Allen shows. Irwin Allen was producing multiple science fiction series simultaneously during the 1960s, and he became notorious among fans for constantly recycling the same props, set pieces, and costume elements across all of his different shows to save money on production costs. The Time Tunnel shared a massive inventory of futuristic equipment with other Allen productions like Lost in Space, Voyage to the Bottom of the Sea, and Land of the Giants. And even the Batman series got in on the action by borrowing some of the same blinking computer panels and electronic gadgets that appeared in Allen's shows. Eagle-eyed viewers who watched multiple series during this era would frequently spot the exact same control panels, alien costumes, ray guns, and piece of high-tech equipment popping up in completely different fictional universes, which could be pretty jarring if you were paying close attention. The computer banks in the Time Tunnel control room were particularly famous for making appearances across multiple shows, and fans quickly learned to recognize these distinctive props no matter what color they were painted or which series they were appearing in that particular week. Even the alien costumes and weapons that showed up in the Time Tunnel's futuristic episodes were often the same outfits and props that had been created for Allen's other television productions and theatrical films, just repurposed with maybe a few minor modifications to make them look slightly different. This widespread prop sharing was such a defining characteristic of the Irwin Allen production style that it became something fans looked forward to spotting as a kind of Easter egg connecting all of his shows together. Fact 14. The same sound effect powered the Tunnel and Planet of the Apes. Sound effects libraries were commonly shared across different productions at major Hollywood studios during the 1960s, which meant that the same distinctive audio cues would often turn up in multiple films and television shows, sometimes in completely unrelated projects. The Time Tunnel had a particularly memorable sound effect that played whenever the tunnel was powering up to send someone through time or bring them back. And this distinctive audio became one of the most recognizable elements of the show for fans who watched it every week. What many viewers didn't realize at the time was that this same sound effect had a much longer life beyond the Time Tunnel and was used in numerous other 20th Century Fox productions throughout the decade. The most famous reuse of this sound came in the 1968 science fiction classic Planet of the Apes, where the exact same audio effect was used for the Icarus spacecraft as it entered the atmosphere of the mysterious planet at the beginning of the film. The sound also appeared in Lost in Space, another Irwin Allen series, where it was used for the Jupiter 2 spacecraft, showing that the studio really got their money's worth out of this particular piece of audio. Sharp-eared viewers who were fans of multiple science fiction productions from this era would have immediately recognized the sound and known exactly where it came from, creating an unintentional audio connection between the Time Tunnel, Planet of the Apes, and other Fox science fiction properties from the same period. Fact 15. Teachers used the show to teach history. Despite the fact that the Time Tunnel was riddled with historical inaccuracies and errors throughout its entire run, from getting Captain Smith's first name wrong on the Titanic to stating that the Battle of New Orleans began on January 7th when it actually started on January 8th, the show ended up having an unexpected positive impact on history education in American classrooms. Lee Meriwether, who played Dr. Anne McGregor in the series, later revealed in interviews that the cast regularly received fan mail from school teachers across the country who were using episodes of the Time Tunnel as a teaching tool to get their students interested in learning about historical events. The teachers weren't necessarily showing the episodes and claiming they were historically accurate, but rather they were using the show's dramatized versions of events like Pearl Harbor, the sinking of the Titanic, Custer's last stand, and the eruption of Krakatoa as a way to spark curiosity and excitement about these moments in history. Once students were engaged and interested in the stories because they had seen them brought to life on their favorite science fiction show, the teachers could then guide them toward learning the real facts about what actually happened, using the Time Tunnel as a jumping-off point for deeper historical study. The show's ability to make history feel exciting and adventurous rather than dry and boring turned out to be more valuable than strict historical accuracy, and it introduced a whole generation of young viewers to historical events they might not have otherwise learned about or cared to explore.